Yes.
Really quickly, you mentioned your chart showed the production, where the revenues were coming in, production and assessment cycle.
Right.
That did not include the pipeline. And that has been the stumbling block in Pennsylvania, where they've actually had a lag of like 2 to 3 years because of the pipeline. You mentioned it, but I don't see it on the chart, which would push it back even.
Can I just ask for a second, for the people who are taping, do you need that to be repeated with a mic? And Joe Wilson is here, and we'll walk it around.
So the question that was asked dealt with the pipelines, and we did mention it. The timeline that we put together is the most optimistic, and typically whenever the gas companies start drilling, they have to get a certain amount of gas wells that are producing before they'll run their lines. So you can have a lot of impact from construction long before they'll start actually tapping the well and then letting it run into the lines. And until they tap the well and let it run into the lines, there's no production value that can be taxed from ad valorem. So that your point is well taken. Other questions?
I have one concerning.
You stand up.
Yes.
Thank you.
Even there. Given the timeline that we see here, I'm concerned about another timeline, which is your sense in your discovery period, all of these months, of a timeline with respect to Albany acting. But it's quite serious. I mean, I want you to be able to talk about it, because I'm, as supervisor in Newfield, that's the pressure that I'm feeling and thinking about right now myself. What's the window within which municipal officials can work, make an influence, do what it is that we need to do? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, now's the window. The legislature is in session, and they will be until the end of June. It's time to get their attention, because if the DEC allows permits to be issued by the end of this year, first part of next year, then we will have lost a legislative window. It's also important to make sure that the governor's office hears from you, because he can actually direct his staff to begin working on this unit production value formula. That's going to be play an important role into what the assessed value is going to be, and it needs to be fair and open process.
Yeah, I will say that the taxation can be changed in the future. So if production starts under this formula and New York State is finding that we're not covering costs, although some of us may really suffer seriously, that can be changed. The kinds of land use controls that I ran through quickly and that you can get more detail about, those are the kinds of things that if you don't pass on the municipal level ahead of time, the gas industry can, and then you try to pass later, the gas industry can claim with more validity, and it's always subject to a decision by a court, but it can claim that you only instituted those land use controls for them. Land use controls must be instituted for any activity of a certain impact. It can't just be targeted to certain industries in general. I mean, it's a generalization, but so you need to be doing that now.
And one more point, Richard, before we get to the next question. One of the most important things for all our local governments to be working on is a road preservation law or policy, road use agreements, how we're going to work on with that, because if that's going to be our biggest impact right off the bat once the construction begins, and if we haven't set that policy up, then you're going to be asking the taxpayers to really shoulder a lot of burden dealing with whatever you have to deal with to get this under control. So that's an internal thing to work on. And then at the state level, should not be afraid to ask to point out this time lag and the fact that we need the state to come up with a revenue source to help us out. Next question.
Hi, I was wondering, again, road usage laws are extremely important. I was wondering if anyone looked into the amount of money Chesapeake put into roads just last year and a couple previous years before that, fixing roads that have been damaged either from weather and their heavy usage. And also, I was wondering if anyone looked at the tax assessment of Elk Lake School District. the taxes that they're making. They have one vertical well and one horizontal well on their property that are active. Have you guys looked into that at all?
Well, I'll take the road use law agreement first. There are companies that come in and are looking to negotiate road use agreements, and some are more willing than others to come in and build roads. And I think after early lessons that were learned in Pennsylvania, that roads that were existing just were not supporting the trucks. And some of the early pictures that we saw of trucks being literally hauled across ditches that had formed, most of the companies, I believe, have been a lot better, but they really vary.
See, I picked
some
Chesapeake
companies
because
have
I did
been
see that in
yes.
your presentation.
Some companies have been better than others at doing that, and at doing it in some spots as opposed to others. We looked at this for a very long time. Tompkins County's road use law allows the formation of a road use agreement proposed by a company if we so choose, but sets a base that says here's our law. It needs to at least meet or exceed this standard.
Absolutely.
And I didn't quite. Your second question, I didn't catch the school district that you asked about.
Chesapeake actually put $400 million into roads in Pennsylvania. The tax assessment, as far as like what a school can see revenue for if they have wells on their property, is one example. Elk Lake School District down in Dimick, royalties, right? Also leasing and things like that. But in royalties in 1 year, Elk Lake School District last year made $1 million in royalties that's used in the school district. They've completely rebuilt things around it. Their track team is absolutely outstanding. They go above and beyond. And also with their money, they've actually basically graced people who couldn't pay their bills last year as far as school taxes. They put almost $900,000 towards school taxes for people who couldn't pay it. So I guess my two questions were, did you look into that, just because I didn't see that represented in your slides?
Yeah, those would be covered under the communities that we talked about as being sweet spots, where there will be communities that see that kind of income. The questions that still remain are how many communities. The industry model calls for about 20% to have production that really makes their money, and I don't know how many of those are at the actual sweet spot that makes the bulk of the money at the order of magnitude you're talking about. What happens to the rest of them, and what's the period of time under which that operates?
Let me just take a stab at your question as well. We did not look at royalties because that's something that is not part of the taxation system. That would be something that's a choice that the individual municipality can make. So it's not a foregone conclusion. That's why we didn't look at it. And we didn't pay attention or even acknowledge that there are gifts being given by the gas companies, because that's not predictable either. We were trying to work on predictable things. Part of the process that, as you remember from the environmental conservation law, gives us specific things that we can talk about, and that's what we were investigating and not trying to go beyond that. So we're not talking about income tax or any other revenue sources.
Is there nothing other than this kind of taxation that can provide for some of the costs, such as social services or law enforcement? Is it only through taxes? Is there no ability to assess a fee in any way? Is that considered regulation, or is that something that could be explored?
That's a county issue. I can't answer that. There's Joe Mariano, unless he left. He might be able to help you with that. I don't know of any fee structure for that. That's exactly why the severance tax needs to be set and then shared with local governments, because those impacts come right off the bat, and we need to have revenue to work with it.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that the kinds of expenses you're asking about, social services and other things that aren't necessarily specific to the particular town that will be netting the income, or county, if they're this county land, that would be royalties. That wouldn't be taxes. There are county taxes as well. But the kinds of things that you're asking about, in the white paper, what we're basically recommending is that the state institute a series of severance taxes that get allocated on formulas back to cover things like Frank Krupa's health department, and then the other kinds of costs.
I'm not so optimistic about the state doing what's right, and so that's why I'm wondering whether there are any powers, authorities, abilities to, at a county level, do something to get revenues when, I mean, there's road use agreements and so or road use stuff, but in terms of these other very significant costs, is there anything else that one can do to put a fee on? Martha's shaking her head.
Yeah.
So we have several people from the county shaking their head. They're currently not raising that fee, and they, of course, with a property tax cap, you'd think they'd be looking at something like that. So,
Well,
Martha?
I'm not sure. And it was a question I had about fees. You said that the state should institute permit fees that would be sufficient to cover upfront costs, and those would to be shared with municipalities. Now, we are not allowed to, for example, the health department has fees for lots of things, and they have to be calculated to cover costs, but not to exceed those costs. So we can't make money on a fee. We need to just cover the cost, and you can't even say, well, overall the health department has other expenses, so income from this thing is going to cover that thing. So I don't know how that would work here, because if the permit fee is established in order to throw off extra money to cover future costs of municipalities, that would require, I think, a different structure than we are able to use in any other kind of fees that we set. And yeah, Joe's in the back. Maybe put him on the spot.
But while he's getting his thoughts together, I will say that on the local level, we can and do institute fees. If you apply under the road use law, there will be a fee to process your application. Building departments of your various towns have fees, and towns can look at what structure of the fees they'd like to implement there. It's more of a limited ability at a not a really high level. The state, the kinds of options that were presented to the state advisory panel included fees that were at a much higher level. Speedy's construction general permit fees, drilling permit fees, paid to the DEC. Operating permit fees, well transfer fees, compulsory integration fees, well spacing variance fees, if they want to vary on the spacing, fees for leasing of state lands, and again, those would be something on a local level. And then somewhere I saw mentioned a municipal fee, that there would be some general fund that would be established for municipalities that have no potential for drilling in their municipality, but bigger cities that still need to address some of the road and other issues. But it's the order of magnitude, and maybe, Joe, I don't know if you have anything you want to add. Where are you? There.
I think you've hit most of it. Permits, Martha is absolutely right. We can only charge kind of what the real costs are. And for road preservation, as a part of the permit process, we expect to get back exactly the amount of damage to cover the damage that was caused to the roads. The only other thing that I would add is what we can do with revenues is very tightly restricted by New York State. So we can't just go out and invent new fees. It's really tightly regulated by New York State. They give us a menu of revenues that we can apply. So it's very difficult just to come up with a new thing, as appropriate as it might seem, without getting the state involved in approving that revenue.
I meant at the end of this, before we get to the next question, I meant at the end of our presentations to ask Jay or Al if they had anything in particular that they wanted to add to what we said, or just you're here to respond to questions if people have. So we do have the director of our Department of Assessment and one of our top assessors here if people have questions for them as well. Any other?
On the lag time on the taxes, you mentioned the increase in rental housing costs and the shortage of rental housing, but if gas drilling creates a shortage of rental housing, it probably causes a shortage of other service businesses. And if those property values are going up because there's a shortage, won't that create a revenue stream almost immediately? Because the assessments will go up on those properties.
There still is a time lag between when.
It wouldn't be 3 years. I mean, my
Right.
assessment went up in 3 days, so.
I think it would be 2 years from the
2
time.
years?
Yep.
Okay.
But
Hopefully, you'd have a lot of apartment rentals going up and in order to make up for the difference, but. Question away.
Yeah, some of the stuff you talked about was you took the most pessimistic, negative attitude you could towards it. For instance, I've done some research on some of these things. You stood up there and talked about how awful it would be on the roads and how costly. But I'm reading from a Penn State study of Washington and Susquehanna counties that had more than 150 wells drilled in each one of them. Let me quote it. All the township officials noted that the gas companies have been proactive in repairing and upgrading roads, and they have been doing so at the company's expense. It gets even better. Some of the townships have said the better quality roads installed by the companies require additional township costs for maintenance, repair, and snow plowing. So, Joe, you got to stop those companies from improving our roads. You mentioned the price of natural gas and quoted the $2 something price, but you didn't mention that we can sell it overseas for 6 times that price, which would impact a little differently than what you want to point out. And you talk about the various revenues, and it's realistic. You're looking at those that you can impact directly, but you forget some other ones. Again, I'm taking from Penn State studies of what's happened in Pennsylvania. In between 2010, the average change in sales tax rate in non-Marcellus shale wells, it dropped 6.5%. In the 5 counties that had 150 wells drilled, it went up 11.3%. Some of that theoretically would come back to the towns, to the state, to the counties. The income tax in non-Marcellus, it went up 0.89%. In Marcellus wells, it went up 7%, 6.96%. Again, some of that's going to come back. You're painting the most negative picture, and when it comes down to in Pennsylvania, they separated rights, royalties, and patent revenue, which would include the royalties, etc. In non-Marcellus wells, it went up 86%. In non-Marcellus counties. In counties that had just 10 wells in it, it went up 325%. Those are revenue streams. Some of that's going to come back to the county to cover these additional expenses, but you ignored all those. Why?
So I will say that we were, as I mentioned earlier, that we were looking at the ad valorem, which is what the purpose of our study. Article 230303 of Environmental Conservation Law gives local governments that authority. Anything else which is not under the control of a local government. So we did not do a comprehensive tax revenue, nor did we do a comprehensive description of what the cost would be. That's more time and energy to put in, and that's something that we continue to need to work on because we were asked the questions by the state, what are the costs are going to be that the local governments will have to pick up, and we're trying to quantify those. The Association of Counties is working on that same calculation. And trying to think what else. You had a whole bunch of things, but I want to thank you for sharing all the revenues that other areas are able to get, and I'm not sure how that all plays out in this area.
Yeah, I will also say I hope that it did come through that we were looking at both sort of best case and worst case scenarios, that in those 20% or fewer of towns in which and wells for which there is a sweet spot, yes, there can be the kind of numbers that you're talking about. What we're looking at as municipal officials and county officials is what does this do to our need to budget on a year-to-year basis? And yes, we for those who can build new football stadiums for their local school districts and whatever other one-time expenses, or maybe even multi-year but not forever kind of expenses, there could be money here, and I don't think that we denied that at all.
I'm wondering if Tompkins County is actually in a better situation to deal with this in budgeting, only because we have such a large student influx every year. And don't we have with social services and those kind of things, don't we already kind of budget, or aren't we better at that maybe than some other counties or some other areas in New York State, just because of kind of who we are here with the large influx that we have, annually? Can anybody?
Well, there are two revenue streams, that actually many that we put on the slide: the school districts, the county, the town, fire districts, and so on. And they each have different responsibilities. So at the town level, we do not have social services responsibilities. Actually, for the smaller towns, the bulk of our expenses go towards road issues. And it was mentioned earlier, and I mentioned to Richard Driscoll, it's important that local governments spend the time to come up with a road use policy and a road use agreement, so that they are transferring that expense to the developer and not to the taxpayer. And you want to speak to the county?
Well, we do have an economy here that is in better shape than a lot of upstate New York, but I'll tell you, as chair of the county's Facilities and Infrastructure Committee, that we have, I believe, was it $6 million of need to just do our annual maintenance to our county highways, and only $1.65 million this year that we had available to allot to that. So the condition of our roads, we're already challenged to be able to maintain it. We are concerned about the heavy industry. One heavy truck puts as much wear and tear on roads as, I believe it's something like 15,000 cars. So we still feel challenged about whether we're going to be able to keep balancing our budget. And then there are a whole other, again, where I talked about the other parts of the gas drilling task force that has looked at some of these other issues in terms of character of the community and what we might see and how it might change. And there's been a lot of community discussion here about the desire of the community to enhance and keep enhancing the long-range kinds of development, that's the sustainable development that higher education and other kinds of activities you mentioned have brought here for, 125 years.
If I can make a comment, Ron and Tom, I think what you're talking about are the taxes and taxes paid by individuals, by landowners, by individuals through sales or income taxes because of economic activity, and that's one thing. But they're talking about, I think they're talking about the cost of doing business for the gas companies, for the industry. And I remember hearing Pennsylvania, I think, had no taxes, I'm pretty sure, initially for the gas companies, and all the economic benefit that they talked about basically was paid by the individuals, by the not by the companies, but by people as a result of the economic activity. And yes, of course, in a full economic analysis, you want to look at all that. But I think the issue here is that you're looking that a company ought to pay when they're removing a resource from the state. That's the severance taxes, because it's a resource that's being extracted and it will not be there again. It's severed. So when a company is coming in and doing that, having that kind of an impact, there needs to be a structure that recognizes this and not just makes the state and the local communities whole, but actually there should be some value added. There should be the people of the community and the state should see some reward from that. The reward shouldn't just go to Texas and Arkansas, whatever. there should be something that comes in a fundamental way back to the community. And I think that's the structure of these kinds of taxes is what they're talking about.
Yeah, I'll add to that 35 other states that have more experience with gas drilling than we do institute these kinds of taxes to make the community whole. So we're not asking for anything that isn't done across the country. Is there one more question, and then people can stay and talk to us afterwards, but we did promise to get you out of here.
Isn't there a bit of a fundamental economic question here about these various taxes? Other states have been levying severance taxes for years. I spent a lot of time in Louisiana. They run their state on a severance tax. And that severance tax is actually being paid by us. Every time we go to the gas pump, we pay Louisiana severance tax. The states that have been levying these taxes have been passing them through. So if we put a severance tax here in place here in New York, the implication is that the gas companies will pay it. The reality is, isn't it, that that tax will be passed through, and they will set it up so that we heat our homes or go to the gas pump. That tax will be built into our prices. So in effect, the taxpayers will pay it, not as taxpayers, but as consumers. So I think when we look at the question of severance taxes, we have to remember at the end analysis, corporations don't pay taxes. We do. We pay them in our consumer role, if not in our taxpayer role. So putting these costs on the industry doesn't mean we're not going to pay them, that they aren't going to come down ultimately to us.
Yeah.
So thank you for that sobering comment about corporations don't pay taxes.
They don't.
That's really important for us to consider. One of the interesting things about your economic analysis is that we're talking about spreading this out over a nation as opposed to just one specific town. And I think that's what we're talking about here is equal sharing the cost among everyone and not just having a few local taxpayers pay for it. So I know everyone has a lot to talk about at dinner tonight because you just got a lot of information. So I want to thank you for coming. And we'll be up here for a bit to answer any further questions. Thank you.